Sorry. Okay, so that wasn't such a great start. So my name's Zeddy Chaudhry. Thank you for that introduction, Sue. Firstly, I'd like to thank the organisers of this conference for having me here today. So this is my first time visiting New Zealand, and from first impressions, you guys have such extraordinary landscape, but most importantly, everyone that I've met so far has been very warm and welcoming. I'd also like to take a moment to thank and acknowledge the individuals who organised the order in which the speakers would present and decided to place me after Johan Hari. The only upside about following that incredibly inspirational talk is that hopefully you're all very much awake and you're used to the accent by now. So before I delve into the exciting stuff, I'll give you a little bit about my background. So as Sue mentioned, sorry, technical difficulties, it's not at the start. Sorry, I think Dan looks like he's on it. Is that good to go? Thanks. Okay. So a little bit about myself. So at the minute, I'm currently doing my doctoral research at Sheffield Hallam University. For those of you who aren't familiar with the UK, Sheffield is in the north of England. It's built on 7 different hills, and it has some beautiful landscapes around it. And I've been in the field of recovery since I did my undergraduate degree there. And since then, I've spent some time working with offenders in prison and community settings, both as a peer mentor and an employee. And my role at that time was to try and reduce reoffending rates and also support individuals by connecting them back into their community. Whilst I was working there, I became very interested in working with people who had substance misuse issues just because it was so rife in the prisons that I was working with. So I went on to do that. And whilst I was working in the addiction field, I supported the development of a program for women offenders specifically who had substance misuse issues because we recognised that there was a different set of needs compared to their male counterparts. And that led me on to my current PhD topic, which looks at pathways that support women reintegrating back into society post-custodial sentences. I've also spent some time working with children in care as well whilst I was doing a master's degree in psychology, and that's because I was really interested in this particular vulnerable group of individuals as they often end up getting involved in the criminal justice system or involved with some form of addiction. So I spent some time quite interested in the preventative measures that we could do and the work that we could do there. But right now, alongside my PhD, I'm currently thoroughly enjoying being involved in some exciting research projects that are being led by David Best, who, as Sue mentioned, was here in 2016. So both of us are based at the Helena Kennedy Centre, and this is a centre that supports human rights issues and issues of social justice. And we do that through research, both locally and internationally. David's conducted research in Australia, America, and the UK, and he's also an honorary professor at the ANU University. And there's a link on the slides to his bio there in case anybody wants to have a look at some of the other research that he has been involved in. He left quite a lasting mark when he was last here, because as Sue mentioned, she was contacted after the conference and asked if this particular person could be one of his disciples. You'll be pleased to know that I texted him last night and I told him that, and he texted me back this morning saying that I can be in charge of being his agent. So if anyone is interested, just get in touch after the conference. So the idea behind much of the research that David has been leading on is that essentially recovery is attractive when problem solving for individuals who are wishing to access recovery is approached through a strengths-based model. And this is important because in this process, we acknowledge the importance of social connections, generating hope and appreciating people's aspirations. And recovery is very much a social issue. It's something that's already been brought to light this morning. And this is one of 2 presentations that I'll be doing this week. In today's talk, I'll be arguing that social networks play a key role in an individual's recovery journey, and that changing social networks is often critical for many people who wish to attempt to sustain their recovery. The problems often lie, though, for individuals when it comes to actually finding and accessing positive assets and networks. So I'll discuss how, as workers and researchers and peer mentors in the recovery field, we can support and facilitate this process through practical measures. And I'll be doing this by going through the following processes. So number one, we'll look at how we can identify those community groups and activities. And we do that through a process called asset mapping. We'll look at how we can support peer champions, so mentors, to engage with community groups and activities. And this develops something called community connectors, which again, I'll explain more throughout the presentation. And finally, making effective links. So we do this through a process called Assertive Linkage. And this is the part that actually links the entire process together. So before I talk about the specific research studies that support these, I'd like to spend 10 minutes or so just talking about why it is that connection is so important. Why is it important to have meaningful relationships in our lives? And what do we know right now that suggests we should be focusing all of our efforts on connection? So could you please raise your hand if at any point you've ever felt lonely? I think I could raise both hands for that one. So as you can see, if you look around, that pretty much takes the majority of the room. And for those of you that didn't raise your hand, I'd really like to talk to you in the break. So majority of us know how it feels to be lonely. And more often than not, those feelings are unpleasant. And they're generally just not nice. And that's because we're social animals. And it's why solitary confinement is one of the cruelest punishments that we actually have today. So it's important to note, though, from an evolutionary psychology perspective, feeling lonely isn't always a bad thing, but that's because it reminds us to connect with other people. It reminds us to fulfill what is a basic human need. So although many of us have experienced these feelings at some time or another, it often gets overlooked and dismissed in our society. And that's because in this day and age, we pride ourselves on self-reliance. And this is concerning because persistent loneliness can leave a mark, both psychologically and physically. So who are those who are often at risk of feeling persistently and chronically lonely? Well, it's usually the marginalized individuals in society. So that's vulnerable groups, people excluded because either perhaps of a disability, maybe misuse of drugs, alcohol, a history of offending behavior, or even the elderly. And this has also been recognized in a report called the Loneliness Report. So this was commissioned by the government in the UK, and it was put together by the late Jo Cox in 2016, who unfortunately passed away in 2016. And she was working to set an agenda that would tackle loneliness as a prime concern. So the report stated that being lonely or not is equivalent in impact to being a smoker or a non-smoker. Loneliness alters our behavior. It increases our chances of indulging in risky habits, such as drug taking, and it plays a role in mental disorders, such as anxiety and paranoia. So the report also goes on to state that loneliness makes it harder for us to control our habits and our behavior. And tests by US psychologists have shown that the expectation of isolation reduces our willpower and our perseverance, and it makes it harder to regulate our behavior. So lonely middle-aged adults who will drink more alcohol, have unhealthier diets, and take less exercise than their socially connected counterparts. So what we're hearing here is that loneliness isn't only a result of a health concern, it's also the onset and the cause of many health issues. And Jo Cox's legacy lives on in the fact that the recommendations that were made from this report are currently being actively addressed. So for example, in the UK, we currently have somebody that is appointed as a Minister of Loneliness. That's their actual title. And they're involved in developing initiatives to reduce loneliness. So for example, Age UK is the largest charity who work with older people in the UK, and they're combating loneliness by offering a befriending service which provides companionship, either through face-to-face or telephone support. And the UK Prime Minister, Theresa May, who is fully supportive of all of this, has commented and said that loneliness is an important issue because it's the sad reality of modern-day life. And the sad reality here is that we live and work in a particular way, which is having a negative impact on our mental and emotional health. So Paul Verhey's book, What About Me, is a fascinating read, and I'd highly recommend it, within which he argues that the fact that we live in a neoliberal society plays a key role in shaping our identities. So his main concern is how social change has altered the way that we think about ourselves. And he investigates 30 years of neoliberalism, privatization, and the relationship between our engineered society and the individual society. And he states that what we're experiencing nowadays is something called excessively competitive individualism. And at the same time, we live in a way that results in seeking pleasure at all costs. And this can be a spell for disaster for lasting relationships. And a key statement that he makes in his book is that he states that loneliness is without doubt the most widespread disorder of our time because we're losing connection with each other. So what is connection? Well, Brené Brown's definition of connection is it's the energy that exists between people when they feel seen, when they feel heard, and when they feel valued, and when they can give and receive without judgment, and when they derive sustenance and strength from that particular relationship. So we know why it's important, because it can fix and prevent loneliness, but the types of connections that we make in order to fix or prevent loneliness is arguably just as equally important as it is to have those connections. And this is supported by a study called the Harvard Study, which is a study on adult development, and it shows that good, close relationships are good for our well-being. So this study is one of a kind because it's a lifespan study, and they set out to research what makes a good life, what makes and keeps people happy. So they followed over 700 men over 75 years, and they're now studying more than 2,000 people, and this includes these men's wives, children, and so on. And so year after year, the researchers would either go to these individuals' homes or call them up by phone. They would ask them about their work and home life. And as time progressed, they also collected other various bits of information, such as blood tests, brain scans. But the lessons that they learned from the copious amount of data that they collected was that, firstly, social connections are really good for us, and loneliness kills. So people who are more socially connected to their friends, family, and their community are not only happier, they're physically healthier, and they generally live longer lives than those who are isolated. And those who are more isolated than they want to be will find that their brain functioning declines sooner, and they'll live shorter lives. The second biggest lesson from the Harvard study is that it's not the number of friends you have, and that it's not the number of connections that you make, but it's the quality of those that matter. So as we know, people in committed relationships or long-term marriages aren't always happy. So I won't ask you guys to raise your hands on this one, but it's the quality of those relationships that really matter. So you might argue every day with your partner because they sleep through their alarm and you're the one that has to get up every morning to turn it off. But if when you leave that house, you leave knowing that that person is always going to be there for you no matter what, and that you can always truly rely on each other, you're more likely to lead, both of you are more likely to lead healthier lives, both physically and psychologically. So Waldinger is now the fourth director of this ongoing study, and he reports that out of their sample, elderly men in unhappy relationships reported experiencing physical pain, which was magnified by emotional pain, whereas people who were in happy relationships and also experienced physical pain, it's found that their moods just stayed the same and they remained happy. And there's not many studies like this that have collected data over decades like the Harvard study. So usually too many participants will drop out, researchers will move on, or funding simply just gets lost, whereas this study is still ongoing, and that is why it's a fantastic example alone to demonstrate why connection is so important and why it's relevant for all of us here today. It's showing us the same reoccurring messages, that connections play a key role and a key factor in ensuring our well-being. And I'd just like to share some stats with you as well. So 1 in 5 Americans report being lonely, and in New Zealand, the Interray assessment, which was led by the Ministry of Health, stated that 1 in 5 elderly New Zealanders also report being lonely. So this really is a global concern. The good news is that we can prevent loneliness becoming chronic because we can tackle the needs of the groups that are socially excluded and at risk of isolation. So we can prevent it. So that sounds great, right? But how do we do that? Well, I do have a way, and I'm going to share that with you today throughout today's and tomorrow's talk. Because if I told you straight away, then I'll have nothing to talk about. So although the methods that I will describe today are applicable to various different groups in different settings, I'll focus mainly on one particular group of individuals who are at risk of being chronically lonely, excluded from society, and in need of reconnection. And that is individuals who are wishing to access and maintain recovery from substance misuse. So to talk a bit about recovery. Recovery is defined by the Betty Ford Institute as a voluntarily maintained lifestyle characterized by sobriety, personal health, and citizenship. So people typically have around an 8-year window in the treatment system, and obviously these figures are generalized and they aren't true for everyone, but it takes around 4 to 5 attempts for people in treatment to achieve their objective, whatever their objective is. So abstinence is often just a start, and it's the beginning of a journey. And we've been so focused on pathologies that we fail to address the post phase, and we don't spend enough time, effort, or investment on social interventions that are required to prevent relapse. So if you remember, a minute ago, Waldinger said that the second biggest lesson that we learned from his study on adult development is that it's the quality of our social connections which is key. So this is something that I'd like to focus on at the beginning. And this is crucial to bear in mind whilst I look at social network processes. So social identity. So social identity is important. And it's important that we understand this particular model it's important that we understand about this. And I'm going to present a particular model that demonstrates how individuals' social identity will change during their recovery journey. So there's been considerable research on the role of the individual identity change, but there's less on the idea of social identity change. And one of the core parts here is understanding that an individual social identity is how people perceive themselves in their social groups. So what the social identity model of change is proposing is that identity changes is as much about the groups that you belong to as it is about the individual process of change. And this model was actually tested in a study that was led by David in Australia. And the participants in this study were entering a therapeutic community. So a therapeutic community is a residential centre which supports individuals who are wishing to overcome their substance misuse issues. So data was collected, and the data was collected in a way to match people's social identity. And it was collected at 3 different time points. So at entry into the therapeutic community, at the end of their time in the therapeutic community, and then 6 months post when they were back living in their communities. So as you can see here, with initial exposure to recovery groups, people will slowly start to mix. So as you can see here, during active use, people will slowly start to mix with non-using groups. And the balance slowly shifts when they're in early recovery, and these non-using groups and recovery groups become more prevalent. And then once they're in stable recovery, there's been a shift, and actually they associate themselves perhaps more so with their non-using groups and their recovery group as opposed to their using group. So as you can see here, it doesn't mean that you have to completely isolate yourself from those individuals who are still using, because that's not realistic. Because you'll often find that people have a strong social bond with those particular groups that are still using, because it could be their families or their friends. But what's important to note here is that the idea is to get people to transition from being in groups that are associated with substance misuse, where they have high degrees of bonding capital, but they don't have any bridging capital, so to support them to get back and integrate into their community and wider society. And this model is based on 2 different theories. So the first theory is the social identity theory, and this talks about how we get a sense of ourselves derived from a group. So this provides structure for that person's perceptions, and you'll find that you'll be given exposure to the development of your norms, values, and your beliefs through this particular group. And when you adapt them, that's basically the lens in which you see the world, which is why it's so important that we acknowledge that your social identity plays a huge role in recovery. And the second theory is a self-categorization theory. So this theory argues that increasing status within the group depends on the extent of your affiliation with that group. So how much you see yourself as a representative of that group. And an example of this is AA, Alcoholics Anonymous. So you'll all have access to these slides after the conference, and on the very first slide, I had a link to this particular paper, which David led on, and it talks about how Alcoholics Anonymous is a perfect example of this shift in identity and the theories that I've just mentioned. So A key argument which is presented in the paper is that identity change is bound up within AA's group membership and its capacity to furnish active members with a new sense of social identity. So Alcoholics Anonymous, as you all probably know, is a mutual aid group, and it's based on a 12-step program. So there'll be weekly to sometimes daily meetings, depending on the area that you're in. You're advised to read recovery literature, and everyone there has the same goal, which is to achieve abstinence. So Keith Humphreys, in his core text called The Circle of Recovery, he states that there's evidence to suggest that there is an indication of a number of basic rules when you're engaging with such mutual aid groups. And he states that the more attendance, the stronger the benefit that you will receive. He also states that the more that you actively participate in the group, again, the stronger the benefit. And this fits in line with both social identity and the self-categorization theory. It's about feeling that you belong to that group. And AA has been proven to have positive effects on depression. So it's not just the case that brain functioning influences behavior, but behavior, particularly social behavior here, can influence the brain. And group changes facilitate psychological change. So there's growing literature that focuses on community engagement as an initial ingredient for recovery. And the social identity model of recovery shows how these connections cause a shift in that social identity to support maintenance. And it's the engagement in recreational activities, mutual aid such as this, and other peer activities which are really important components. And this is supported by something that we called asset-based community development, which has a really nice and easy acronym. So ABCD is a strategy for community-driven development. The appeal is that people in communities drive the development process themselves because they're the ones that identify and mobilize the community's assets. So it's defined by Matthew and Cunningham as a mechanism that can be used in order to create, encourage, and actively ensure that connections are being made which will support a person's recovery journey. And the role of social capital is evident in this development process, but that's something that I'll focus on a little bit more in tomorrow's talk. So the three processes that allow ABCD to occur are these. And these are the things that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. These are the practical interventions that I'm now going to go through that we can all be utilizing here today. So an important thing to mention is that we need a positive strengths-based outlook when we're looking at the assets in our community. And that's what this slide is about. So these are the four different assets. Well, these are the four different categories of assets that you can find in your community. So employment, education, training, sport and recreation, mutual aid, and professional services. And what's important about this slide, is that we should be looking at the glass as half full. It's about what we already have and what we need. It's not about just what we're lacking. I hope no one's got motion sickness because... Right, so the process. So we'll start with asset mapping. So in order to be able to refer people to appropriate groups or activities that they'd like to engage with in their community, we need to know what the community actually has to offer. So what groups and activities actually exist? And if you work as a recovery or support worker or even a peer mentor, you'll probably have some idea of some of these in your local area, but groups constantly change. Timetables are always changing, locations alter, and there's always new activities which are sprouting up. So it's difficult to keep track of them. And I spent much of my summer in New York this year, and there was constantly a huge amount of free events and socials going on. So for example, they had free yoga sessions in Bryant Park on a weekly basis. There were free jazz concerts going on in Times Square, in Harlem. There were some free salsa classes that I took part in. There was just numerous things, and park runs. So there was lots of different activities. But New York is a really extreme example because it has a huge population, and it really is a city that just doesn't sleep. And it's the complete opposite of an area that I lived in when I was about 13 years old. And this is a little village in Scotland that most Scottish people probably haven't even heard of. So besides fishing, the most exciting thing that I remember happening was sheep blocking the road on my way to school, and that's about it. So in terms of assets that that community would have, I really wouldn't be able to list any. So as a key worker, this is why you can understand it would be very difficult to track what your community has to offer, especially when you think that you know a place. because what I believed only existed in this village was so wrong. Because actually, what they do have is weekly bingo events. They have some of the best fishing in the country. They have some incredible mountain biking trails and some amazing hikes of some stunning waterfalls that even 14-year-old me would have absolutely have loved. I just didn't know about them. So in order to understand what Sheffield has to offer, which is the city where David and I are both based in, the Rec Connect study looked to identify the assets that existed within our city which would support individuals who are wanting to access recovery treatment. So there was a group of people from Sheffield who were recruited by all these different agencies. So they were all involved in this study. So you've got agencies there that support alcohol services, agencies such as Ad Action who work with people who have drug issues and involvement in the criminal justice system. Our local city council was involved. And everybody managed to round up a group of individuals who were in long-term recovery. So that's the important part here to remember. And what we refer to these individuals as was they were the community connectors. And they were given a task. So they had about 3 to 4 months to try and identify as many assets as they possibly could. And they were asked to categorize them into the 4 topics, which we're going to go through now. So this is what they found. So in terms of recreation and sport, these are all the assets that they came up with. In terms of mutual aid, this is a list of the assets that everybody found. And in terms of recovery community groups, and also volunteering, education, and employment. So what we've just flipped through there very quickly is that there were 134 connections made by these community connectors. There were 31 people who were trained to be connectors, and at the bottom of the pyramid, what we have is all the organizations that took part. So the role of the community connector was key, and there were 2 benefits to this role. So not only is your community enriched, because we've put together a list of all the assets that exist, and we're looking to engage people in them, but also those individuals who acted as community connectors, they felt valued, heard, and seen, which, if you remember, relates back to Brené Brown's definition of connection. And research tells us that individuals in recovery from addiction are twice as likely to be actively engaged in community services than people who have never had an addiction in the first place. So that's twice as likely. That's a pretty high stat. So if you're in recovery, you're a seriously valuable asset to your community. And research commissioned by the New Zealand Drug Foundation has shown that 1 in 3 New Zealanders have a family member who has experienced negative effects in their life due to drugs and alcohol. However, this survey also shows that 15% of New Zealanders don't know where to go for help when they're faced with a family member who has an alcohol or drug problem. And surely we want people in our communities who have addiction problems to be able to access the resources and the support that they need to get into recovery. So we need to shift that stigma that's attached to people in recovery, because actually they're the powerful assets and they have so much to offer in terms of enriching your local community and a community's development process. But we'll talk a little bit more about stigma later on. And one of the major challenges in addiction treatment and the criminal justice reintegration programs has been a reduction in staff time and availability, and that's resulted in caseworking being a lot more office-based and less community-based. And there was a study, which again David led on, in York in the UK, and it was called the Asset-Based Community Development Project. And what they found was that bringing people together to map and mobilize the assets available had potential to become an asset in its own right. So again, participants felt that they were valued, and through those connections made, there was a generative sense of hope and energy. Okay, so now we have community connectors, and we've got the assets in the community, but now we need to bring that process together through something that we call assertive linkage. And assertive linkage is a form of practical support. So there's 2 parts to effective engagement with positive community resources. It's about identifying those resources and then linking them in. So when we say assertive linkage is a form of practical support, I could mean, for example, simply just providing transport to that individual who wishes to access an activity, and emotional support in the sense that the community connector will be encouraging and accompanying them as and when it's essential. So we know from research that giving a leaflet out doesn't work. it's likely that as soon as that person leaves your centre, they're probably going to forget about the leaflet, use it to put their chewing gum in, and chuck it in the rubbish. And I have an example of why assertive linkage is so important, and it's a personal example. So when I was working for an agency that supported people with drug and alcohol problems, I had a particular client that had quite severe anxiety, and he was also homeless. So he refused to use any of the homeless shelters because he physically couldn't bring himself to walk into that room. It was just too much and too overwhelming for him, so he was sleeping on the streets. And as you can imagine, the weather in England in winter isn't great as it is. And I happened to be volunteering at a new homeless shelter that was opening up that weekend. So I suggested to him that he should come down because I would be there. So I would be there to try and support him to actually go inside the building. Unfortunately, my working hours didn't stretch and my job description didn't allow me to leave my desk to do that kind of work. So that weekend, he came down, and as I expected, it was very difficult for him to even step into the building. But the effect that it had for me being there from that first time meant that I could then calm him down because I was somebody that he knew, and I could get him inside and introduce him to other people who would be there every week and who could then continue to support him. And he continued to then go down to the homeless shelter on the weekends, whether or not I was there. And that's exactly what assertive linkage is. So in terms of any barriers that we might experience that can cause frustrations to doing this kind of work, so the one that I mentioned earlier was stigma. Unfortunately, there's a lot of stigma still attached to certain individuals, and that can be quite tough to overcome. But something really important to note is that research has shown that having one positive experience is enough in the face of having so many negative ones. So if you're somebody that's in recovery and you've experienced stigma and you've experienced feeling shameful and being made to feel that way by other individuals when you've attended a certain group, just having one positive experience is enough to make you then come back again. So that's really important for us to know. If we can just give somebody that one positive experience, but then perhaps that's enough to engage them in their community. And the other thing is professional buy-in. So how much do we really believe in what we're selling? Because we're the ones that are selling it. And although we might sell it throughout our 9 to 5, do we take those values and beliefs home with us? And are we actively promoting that in our own communities? And it's just something for us to have a little bit of a think about. Okay. And if anybody would like to hear a little bit more about Recovery Capital and the RecCap assessment tool, which utilizes these methods to facilitate recovery, then please come along tomorrow afternoon to my second presentation then. Thank you.